Hey, buddy, watch this.
Hello, Regis Kilbin is the name, and Hearthstone is the game, and these are the adapt mechanics ranked from worst to best. If you're not familiar with the adapt mechanics, this is a new keyword that will be coming out with Journey to Unguro, and essentially there will be some dinosaurs, it looks like some beasts in particular, that will have the adapt mechanic on their card. Here are the two examples that we've seen released so far, so it'll be an effect that affects both them and perhaps other minions on the board as well. And as you'll see in this list, if you haven't seen the different options yet for adapt, essentially what's going to happen is you'll play the card, you'll be given a discover effect where you get to choose one of three adaptations. It can be things like Wind Fury, Taunt, +3 attack, etc. And that'll be pulled from a pool of 10 different adaptations. And in this video, I'm going to tell you basically of those 10 adaptations, which I think generally are going to be the best and which I think generally are going to be the worst. Now, of course, as with anything, it's highly conditional based on the board state, the deck you're playing, your opponent's deck. I recognize that all of that goes into effect, and that's what makes this mechanic so cool, is that it's going to give you the ability to make decisions and adjust your gameplay based on the game itself, which is always a nice skill rewarding thing. But sometimes there's going to be points where you just play down a minion and you don't really know the context of your opponent's deck, you don't have anything on the board to consider, and in those situations it might be a nice idea to understand which mechanic on average you think is going to give you the most results. And that's exactly what this list, or at least this ranking, is designed to do. And in last place, essentially the worst adaptation as far as I'm concerned, it is Lightning Speed. This one will give your minions Wind Fury. Now, I know Wind Fury, when it works, can be outstanding. You get to do tons of damage. Maybe you get to trade twice very efficiently. But how often have we seen Wind Fury cards in this game fail? And in fact, how often have we seen them succeed? I can think of maybe 2 cards ever that have been successful. Alakir the Windlord and Whirling Zap-O-Matic, I guess, back in the Goblins vs. Gnomes era was played a little bit, but not even then a ton necessarily. So the problem with Wind Fury, as I've said 1,000 times before, is that when you play a minion with Wind Fury, it doesn't have Wind Fury on defense. In other words, you put a lot of resources into an effect that your opponent can remove without any extra effort. If it's a 3/3 minion with Wind Fury, who cares? They just still have to do 3 damage and it's still dead. So they have to be very passive and not kill your minion or not make trades to make your Wind Fury good. And even then, it's often worth something like 3 extra damage to the face, which isn't usually all that significant. So it's going to be tough to make this card successful. If there are charging minions, perhaps Lightning Speed could be better, but even then the same problems kind of apply. Maybe you get to do an extra 3, 4, 5 damage to face, but then you have to make a trade anyway and your minion just dies. So it's often just not going to be worth it unless we see some sort of crazy card that benefits specifically from Wind Fury. I think this one will often be the one you choose last, and that's why it's last on this list. Moving on to the number 9 spot, or the second worst adaptation, I am selecting the card Massive. This one gives your minions Taunt. Now, much in the way of Wind Fury, Taunt often just doesn't do much. It doesn't help you trade any better. It doesn't often affect the board in a significant way. It's a passive effect. So obviously, there's going to be situations where Taunt is far and away your best choice. I understand that. That's the conditionality of the board. If you're going to be dead to a weapon next turn, you have to play the Taunt option. And that's a nice flexibility. When it shows up in the Discover effect of your 3, that's cool. But if you're just playing a minion on an empty board, Taunt is going to give you the least upside, basically, of any other choice. Even Wind Fury would be better in those situations. But since Taunt is so conditionally important occasionally, I did give Taunt 1 spot advantage here over Wind Fury, but I still think that most of the time this will be a pretty bad choice. Up next at the number 8 spot, or the third worst of the adaptations, it's Poison Spit. This will make minions poisonous, which is the new keyword for minions that destroy any minion they have attacked That's a thing we've seen on cards in the past, like Pit Snake. But now that's its own keyword that's actually in the game currently if you go look. So this is really cool, but only if it's on small minions. You'll see I made the note there. Better on smaller minions. And that's because really the advantage for Poisonous is that it allows you to trade up. Emperor Cobra is so scary in Arena because it can trade into Boulder Fist Ogre and still do the job, still make the trade. But if you had a Boulder Fist Ogre with Poisonous, it wouldn't feel quite as good to trade into another Boulder Fist Ogre or a War Golem, for instance, because your minion would die. So you'd be investing 6 mana of stats into that Boulder Fist Ogre, and even though it killed the War Golem for 7 health and Poisonous gave you 1 extra damage essentially, you'd be sacrificing all of your mana in order to do that. But with a card like Pit Snake, if it were to trade into a War Golem, you'd be gaining 5 extra damage essentially. So Poisonous scales better the lower the cost of the minion. But in general, this is just not an effect that has ever taken over the ladder that's been significant, that's been important. And I think that will stay the same. Moving on to the number 7 spot, as we get closer to the halfway decent adaptations in my opinion, is Liquid Membrane. This one means you can't be targeted by spells or hero powers. That's another thing that actually needs a keyword like Poisonous, but for now we just have to write it all on the card. And this one is interesting because this is finally one that does actually protect and preserve your minions. This one has a little bit more of an impact on the board because often your opponents won't be able to kill the minion that receives this adaptation. And that's exactly why I wrote this note here. It's better on larger or even taunt minions because that presents a really big obstacle for your opponent. If it's just something that goes on a small minion, unlike Poisonous, in fact the opposite of Poisonous, your opponent can probably just trade something on the board into it. They don't have to really worry about the presence of that minion. It's just a 2/2, like who cares? It doesn't matter if I can't target it. But if it's like a huge 8/8, suddenly this card becomes a big problem because they have to get something onto the board and then they have to trade it. So the bigger the minion, the more powerful Liquid Membrane's going to be. In fact, if you put this on an 8/8 taunt, as far as I'm concerned, it might be number 1 on this list, so that's one little caveat. But again, on an average minion, on an average game, on an average day, this is going to be a middle-of-the-road one because it doesn't necessarily guarantee you extra value. It just frustrates your opponent and creates some friction, which is good, but doesn't really necessarily do anything directly. Up next at the number 6 spot is Flaming Claws. This one gives a minion +3 attack. Now, stats are always good to get on minions. Extra stats are just obviously good. The problem with 3 attack, of course, is that if you, for instance, played down the 5/4 and you gave it 3 attack, you'd have an 8/4, which would be a lot of stats for the cost, but it'd still be so easily killed. And that's why stats that tend to be more balanced, like a +1/+1, or +3 health, can go farther than +3 attack. But of course, +3 attack can still be significant. So for instance, imagine you play a really cheap 1/2 minion against a priest. It could be stolen, it could be Shadowword Pained, all kinds of stuff. But then you give it Flaming Claws and it's a 4/2, and suddenly you're in that magic range where priest doesn't have an answer to it. There's cool things you can do like that. Also, just sometimes you might have to make a trade up on the board. You could put this on a taunt minion that you know they're trading a minion in, and this enables it to make that trade up or make that kill. This would be particularly good with charge minions. Imagine something like an Argent Horse Rider with +3 attack, right? That'd suddenly be able to kill 5 health stuff without dying. That would be absolutely insane. Also, just sometimes if you needed that extra damage on a Leroy Jenkins, if you gave it +3 attack, that'd be awesome. Now, those are obviously not cards that are going to be adapted, but there might be similar kinds of cards that show up. We don't really know yet. We haven't seen most of the adapt cards, but there are obviously situations where this could be really fantastic. And again, raw stats are often just beneficial, if not quite as beneficial as the other variations of raw stats available. Speaking of raw stats, here's another one that will provide your minions with some extra stats. We've made it to the top 5, and this is Volcanic Might. And instead of +3 attack, this one will give you +1/+1. And I think that's slightly better than the previous option. Now, Situationally, +3 attack is going to make a bigger impact than +1/+1, but on average, +1/+1 will be more beneficial. Even though it provides you with one less total stat gain, you're only getting 2 instead of 3, often just making that minion slightly bigger, a little bulkier, a little more resilient, but also a little more threatening. That balance is more beneficial than going all in on +3 attack, because this does increase the minion's survivability, allowing it to make better trades, live against bigger kinds of removal. So this, on average, on an empty board, is going to give you more results. Moving on to the number 4 spot here, I've put Shrouding Mist. This adaptation will give your minions stealth until your next turn. And in general, stealth is just a really strong, even I would argue, underrated effect. When your opponent can't interact with a minion at all, this is even better than stuff like can't be attacked by spells or can't be targeted by spells or hero powers, because this can't even be traded into when it's in stealth. So really, AoE removal is the only option they have, or some sort of random effect that targets it. So it becomes very difficult to deal with stealth minions. So this is the kind of card that means if you play this, there's a very, very good chance that minion is going to survive into the next turn, giving you the initiative, giving you the control over how that minion interacts with the board and interacts with your opponent, and denying them the same opportunity. Moving on to the top 3, we have another stat buff, but this time it's +3 health. And ultimately, in my opinion, this is the best of the stat buffs, because when it comes to stats, really health is king. You want your minions alive, you want it to be harder for your opponents to kill them, and that's exactly what +3 health will provide. Ultimately, Hearthstone is a numbers game. Your opponents have to have big enough numbers to kill your guys, and when you make your numbers this much larger, that means they have trouble killing your guys. And that's exactly why Rocky Carapace is going to be so good. Moving on to the number 2 spot, it's Living Spores. This one gives your minion Deathrattle summon 2 1/1 plants. Now, that's really in some ways just a stat buff of 2/2. A lot of people think about it that way. But it's so much more than that, because this makes your minion require at least 3 actions to kill most of the time. Now, obviously, silences, AoEs, all kinds of things can reduce that number, but theoretically, if you play down this minion, they have to kill the first minion, and then they have to kill each of the 1/1s as well. So it might take 3 trades, it might take 3 spells, it might take a trade, a spell, and a hero power. Who knows, but it might require 3 cards to deal with a single card. So this just increases the efficiency of the minion so much. It makes it much stickier on the board so that your opponent has a harder time removing everything, which can be really nice in a variety of different decks. It provides you a Deathrattle synergy. And as we know, there are all kinds of Deathrattle synergy cards out there that will make this even better in effect. It's just the kind of card that's, imagine a Savannah Highmane, right? What makes Savannah Highmane so good? It's got a big body on the front end, and then it summons dudes that are really annoying. This is that same kind of idea, but it's in an adaptation. So basically that 5/4 we saw at the beginning could be a little mini Savannah Highmane with this kind of card. It wouldn't be quite as annoying, because 1/1s aren't as good as 2/2s, but it's the same kind of idea, the same kind of value is being generated here for a free adaptation, basically, which is really nice. So ultimately, I think this is going to be one of the best just play it on the board, leave it and forget it kind of cards. But it's not the best adaptation. To me, that honor goes to Crackling Shield, which very simply gives your minions Divine Shield. And Divine Shield is such a fantastically strong keyword in almost any situation. It makes your minions really difficult to remove, especially if your opponent doesn't have some sort of ping effect like the Mage Hero Power, even a ping effect like the Druid or Rogue Hero Power, which can efficiently deal with a Divine Shield, causes them to take often a significant amount of damage in the process, increasing the value of that Divine Shield as well. Not only that, but also making them spend 2 mana on a rather inefficient kind of play as far as tempo is concerned. But Divine Shield also just makes minions really good at trading up for free if you stick a Divine Shield minion and it has initiative, it gets to make such good, efficient trades. Divine Shield works incredibly well with buffing effects, so you can take those, Argent Squire type minions and slam 4 damage onto them, and suddenly they can trade up into ridiculous things for very low cost. In many ways, Divine Shield is sort of the jack of all trades keyword. Now that might sound crazy, but think about it. It essentially gives a minion extra stats, whether that just be 1 health. It could theoretically be an infinite amount of health. You could send a 100 attack minion into a minion with Crackling Shield, and it's going to survive the hit. It doesn't matter how much attack it does if that Divine Shield is present. So infinite health plus whatever health the minion normally has. It essentially gives it twice as much attack value if it's able to attack twice with the Divine Shield. So it's like doubling its attack, which in a way is almost like Wind Fury, right? It often gives a minion taunt, but only in the regards that your opponent feels compelled to kill it. Won't protect you from being dead. It's not that kind of taunt, but it's the kind of card that certainly attracts attention, and because your opponent doesn't want to leave a Divine Shield out there, so they might have to send some resources into it. It just does a little bit of everything. It's annoying, it's frustrating, it creates friction on the board. It's high value for you, and that to me is ultimately why Crackling Shield, I think, has to be the best option on average for adaptations. That said, this list was incredibly hard to create. I moved stuff around 25 times. I put a lot of thought into this, a lot of energy as well, and this is the order I ended up with. It's hard to say without seeing the cards yet. It's hard to say without understanding the meta. I think that if I just had to think about it all in a vacuum, this is probably the right list as far as I'm concerned, but I'd still love to hear your guys' take. What do you think the best adaptation option is going to be? What do you expect to use the most when Journey to Unguro finally rolls around? Did I get something totally wrong? Does Wind Fury actually belong in the top 3? Let me know. I'd love to hear your thoughts, because I've debated myself internally so much. I would love to have some outside perspective on this list. So if you think I'm crazy, if you think I got it all wrong, please let me know. I don't necessarily disagree, and I'm desperate to hear other people's take on this. But until then, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, game on.